Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Amy Cornell, an Episcopal priest in the Diocese of New Jersey. For several years, I have been developing what has been, for me, a wonderful spiritual practice of engaging in the hymns that we can find in our Hymnal 1982. And I have felt the blessing of being able to delve into the deep theological elements of the lyrics that are both timeless and beautiful. And now I want to share this practice with you. I'm planning on a weekly basis to record just some musings around a particular hymn. I'll walk us through a way to engage the text, give some history about the hymn itself, and ask us to contemplate what the words bring up in our own hearts. Sometimes I'm going to be fortunate enough to be joined by colleagues, friends, who will also engage in the text of some of their most favorite hymns. Just a couple of clarifications up front. If you come from a different denomination, you may find that the words that we are discussing are a little bit different than the ones that you are used to. Also, you may not be aware of this, but it's the words of our hymns that are approved by General Convention to be considered sacred texts of the Church. In other words, we could take those words and connect them to any piece of music, and they still will give us that theological depth that we're looking for. So the focus of these videos are not going to be on the music or how the music inspires feeling in us, but it will be based purely on the lyrics. So, to get us started, I've decided to choose, no surprise, my favorite hymn. The hymn number 168, O Sacred Head Sore Wounded, brings up a lot of images and thoughts for me personally. I feel like every time I've engaged in this particular hymn, something else has stood out for me. The words were originally written by Paul Gerhardt, a Lutheran hymnist in the 17th century. The basis of this hymn is a long medieval poem written in 7 parts, each part of which speaks to a various body part of Christ's body as he is hanging on the cross. This epic 7th section is attributed to Arnulf of Leven, who lived in the early to middle 13th century. Now, in particular, this final section of the poem speaks to Christ's head. The imagery that pulls the reader into the detail of the precious head and face of our Savior, describing the injuries caused by the soldiers as they mocked him and nailed him to the cross. It's based on the gospel passages of the Passion of Christ, and in particular, the 19th chapter of the Gospel of John. The first 3 or 4 verses read as such. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, Hail, King of the Jews, and to give him slaps in the face. Now, with this particular passage in mind, let's move on to hearing those words. So take a moment or two to get yourself comfortable in your seat. Maybe take a deep breath. And with our first reading through, listen for what feelings come up to the surface for you. Just identify the different ways that this text makes you feel. O sacred head, sore wounded, defiled and put to scorn, O kingly head surrounded with mocking crown of thorn. What sorrow mars thy grandeur? Can death thy bloom deflower? O countenance whose splendor the hosts of heaven adore. Thy beauty, long desired, hath vanished from our sight. The power is all expired and quenched, the light of light. Ah me, for whom thou diest, hide not so far thy grace. Show me, O love most highest, the brightness of thy face. In thy most bitter passion my heart to share doth cry. For thee, for my salvation, upon the cross to die. Ah, keep my heart thus moved to stand thy cross beneath, to mourn thee, well beloved, yet thank thee for thy death. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever. And I should fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. My days are few, oh, fail not, with thine immortal power to hold me, that I quail not in death's most fearful hour, that I might fight befriended, and see in my last strife to me thine arms extended upon the cross of life. So let's first think about what images stand out or came to our surface while we were listening to that reading. For me, I find this time I'm focusing on the contradictions. The idea that I should both be sorrowful and mourning of Jesus' death, and yet at the same time want to thank Jesus for what he's done. That in spite of the attempt to stifle the light and the beauty of Christ, his love continues to shine through the brightness of his face. Most powerful for me is that simple, contradictory term, crown of thorns. Now, a crown symbolizes royal, wealth, privilege, power. And yet, the thorns, which are all created to point inward, pierce the scalp. It's a corruption of that symbol of power to place a crown of thorns on the most holiest of heads. My second question for you is, where does this hymn connect with you personally? What memories or feelings of other times that you have had those particular images or memories brought to mind? So for me, it resonates very strongly with Holy Week. I started a spiritual practice, oh, my word, when I was probably about 13 or 14, so a long time ago, of doing an overnight vigil in the church from the close of the service on Maundy Thursday to the morning service on Good Friday. And staying in the church in the quiet on vigil, I almost always find myself alone in the evening, early morning, somewhere around like 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock. And I find that I go to this hymn. I pull out the hymnal and I open it and I sing the hymn very softly in that dark space where there's just a few candles lit around the Blessed Sacrament that's residing in the garden for the overnight. And I get a sense of loneliness at that time, and yet not really being alone. Of the barren abandonment that Christ must have felt on that cross, and yet a longing to be there to comfort him and to have him comfort me. And it causes me to wonder, How many people find themselves awake at that time of the night? 2, 3, 4 in the morning, feeling alone and afraid, wanting to reach out to loved ones and yet not wanting to disturb somebody while they're trying to sleep. It strongly reminds me of what it feels like at the times when there's only Jesus. Jesus is the only one who remains with us, waits with us, holds us in our time of need with arms of a friend stretched out to embrace us. And now let's hear those words again and hold those feelings that were brought up in the first reading and allow ourselves to think a little bit deeper. Where do we think God is calling to us in these words? O sacred head, sore wounded, defiled, and put to scorn. O kingly head surrounded with mocking crown of thorn. What sorrows mars thy grandeur? Can death thy bloom deflower? O countenance whose splendor the hosts of heaven adore. Thy beauty, long desired, hath vanished from our sight. Thy power is all expired and quenched the light of light. Ah me, for whom thou diest, hide not so far from grace. Show me, O love most highest, the brightness of thy face. In thy most bitter passion, my heart to share doth cry. With thee for my salvation upon the cross to die. Keep my heart thus moved, to stand thy cross beneath, to mourn thee, well beloved, yet thank thee for thy death. What language shall I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? Oh, make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. My days are few. Oh, fail not with thine immortal power to hold me, that I quail not in death's most fearful hour, that I may fight, befriended, and see in my last strife to thee thine arms extended upon the cross of life. So, where did you hear God's call? What did the Spirit seem to reach into your heart and pull from you? I found myself thinking a lot about Jesus' love. Even as he hung on the cross in so much pain and so much anguish, he still loves us. And then in turn, I thought about the people in my life who I know were going through their own trials and their own issues and concerns, and yet they managed to set aside what was bothering and upsetting them in order to share with me, to listen to me. I think listening is one of those ways that we can show our love for others. Not just letting them talk and ramble on, but actually listening, really paying attention to what they're saying. This hymn brings a true sense of what it means to long. And only by listening to the voices of others can I begin to hear that longing in them, and in turn share with them the longing that I have. I feel a call to listen more intently and to always remind others that Jesus is there for each and every one of us, even in the darkest of the early mornings, even when we are feeling the most alone. He is extending his arms in friendship to me and to you. So, thank you for sharing this sacred time with me. I'm going to include a video link in the comments for anyone who wants to listen to a performance of this particular hymn. I hope it's given you a chance to hear those words and contemplate the meaning behind the passages, to spend a little bit more time than we do on just a typical singing of a hymn during worship service. And so, thank you for spending this time with me. Take care, and God bless.